Hey guys, so we are actually going to finish up foundations of government. We are actually going to talk about the Articles of Confederation, our first government of the United States, and then get into the Constitutional Convention, which will lead us to our next unit, which is one of my favorites, if not my favorite, which is the Constitution. So if you'll follow me along here. So the other day we talked about the Articles of Confederation and I went through the weaknesses. Well, let's talk about now how the Constitution fixes those. So look at the solutions. So it's the idea that instead of one vote for each state, regardless of its size, now you have representation by state and by state's population in a bicameral legislature. Remember, the word bi means two, so think about bicycle. It's got two wheels, and then cameral means house. Congress was powerless to lay and collect taxes or duties in the Articles of Confederation, whereas here Congress has the power to lay and collect taxes and duties. Remember, even though we don't always like taxes, we do need them to function as a society. Congress was powerless to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. Here, Congress has the power to regulate foreign and interstate commerce. So the federal government does that, even though there may be disputes between two states. There's no executive to enforce the acts of Congress. In the Constitution, we have a president of the United States who acts as the chief executive to enforce acts of Congress. There was no national court system in the Articles of Confederation, whereas we do have a national court system, and we'll talk about that later on, going all the way from your Supreme Court down to your courts of appeals to your district courts, and then you also have your state courts. Amendments with only a consent of all the states. Now, amendments can be ratified by 3/4 of the states. As we get into the next unit, you'll see in our long history of the United States, or short history, I guess depends on how you look at it, there are only 27 amendments. A 9/13 majority is required to pass laws. Here, laws were passed by a simple majority of both houses of Congress. And then Articles was only a firm league of friendship, whereas the Constitution establishes a strong national government. So the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, the Connecticut Compromise. And again, a lot of this is basically going back and reviewing what you learned in United States history. But with the Virginia Plan, there were two houses, because you got to remember, Virginia back then was a very big state and they had more population. So it's the idea that both houses, a House and a Senate, would both be based on population, because the more population you have, the more votes you have, and the more influence and to make laws. Whereas the New Jersey Plan at the time was a very small state. So they only wanted one house, and really all they wanted to do was tweak the articles. So, for example, they might say, well, you know what? I understand we don't have a power to tax. Let's fix the power to tax, but that's not completely scrap everything. And so what happened was you had your Virginia Plan, your New Jersey Plan, which took us into the Connecticut Compromise, which is what we have today. And I'm going to go through that. Your Virginia Plan calls for a new government. Remember what Thomas Jefferson said in the Declaration of Independence. He said the people have the right to alter or abolish their government. We saw that the articles simply weren't working, so this called for a completely new government. We're going to scrap and start all over. It was authored by James Madison. Remember, James Madison was the father of the Constitution because he wrote most of it and he took notes. So if you're ever on Jeopardy and there's a question about writing the Constitution, 80% of the time you're going to be right with the answer of James Madison. It called for a bicameral or a two-house legislature. I kind of covered that earlier. We've got a House and a Senate. And representation was based on population in both houses. Remember, Virginia was a big state. So it's the idea that, again, if you have more population, then you got more votes. So you can get passed through what you want to get passed, because Congress is all about power. Who has the votes to get things passed? And then this is a strong national government with 3 separate branches. You know, the one thing that people were against this said, we don't want another king. Remember, we're coming out of England. We're coming out of King George III, who was despised. And it's the idea that those people who supported this Virginia Plan said, look, we got a strong national government. So we've got power coming out of Washington, D.C., but we don't have a dictator. We don't have a king. We don't have a tribal chieftain or an emperor. We have a president who also has to work with its 3 separate co-equal branches, where the executive branch carries out the law, the legislative branch makes the law, and the judicial branch interprets or judges the law. Now, the New Jersey plan, remember, I said they just wanted to amend the articles. Again, let's don't scrap what we have. Let's just fix the current plan. They called for a unicameral legislature. So remember, think about a unicorn or a unicycle. That means one. They wanted equal representation. So it's the idea that each state would have an equal number of representatives to make things fair. So, of course, like in anything, there has to be a compromise. So this was called the Connecticut Compromise because it was named after Roger Sherman from Connecticut, or we also call it the Great Compromise, which is our system of government today. This was a compromise between the Virginia and the New Jersey plans. And what it did was it balanced power between your large and your small states. So how do we do this? Well, we have a bicameral legislature, and you're going to see that most of this compromise is going to look more like the Virginia plan because, again, they had more power, but we still wanted to appease some of your smaller states and try to make this as fair as possible. We have a House of Representatives, which is what benefited the larger states. So again, think about this today. In the United States, our most populated state, what do you think it is? It's California. Okay? So California has 53 members of the House of Representatives, whereas in the state of Wyoming, they have 1. So who do you think has more power in the United States House of Representatives? California with 53 or Wyoming with 1? So that's going to benefit your larger states. It was based on population and elected by the people. Then you have your U.S. Senate. This right here appeased your smaller states. So think about this today. In our United States Senate, do you know how many senators there are? Okay, there are 100. And how you come up with that is there's 2 per state. So 50 states. So whereas Wyoming has 1 member of the House of Representatives, California has 53. Guess how many U.S. senators California has? They got 2. How many does Wyoming have? They got 2. Florida, 2. So you can see here, the Senate is equal. And they were elected by the state legislatures up until the 17th Amendment. You all talked about that in U.S. history last year with the progressive movement. At the time, U.S. senators were picked by state legislatures. They are now chosen by the people. As a matter of fact, this year, not only do we have a presidential election, but one of our U.S. senators, Mark Warner, is up for re-election. And then slaves. How were slaves counted? Well, here's the thing. A little bit of hypocrisy here. Going back to United States history, think about even Dred Scott in that case. How were slaves looked at? They were looked at as property. However, the South wanted to count slaves because guess what? If we can count those slaves, because slaves may have made up 50 to 60% of some states, like, for example, in South Carolina. So if you have more slaves, you've got more people. If you get to count them, that's more representation. So how ironic is that? Is that you get to count African Americans as people, even though they're treated as property, so you can have more influence in Congress to create laws to keep slavery and to keep oppressing certain groups of people. So there was something called the 3/5 compromise, which means that basically slaves were 3/5 of a person. 3 out of every 5 slaves counted. Now, if you're in the South, that's a home run because you're counting 60% of the African slave population to go towards your census, which allows you to go for your representation so you can have more people to represent you in the House of Representatives. And if you look here, I just wanted to show you, this right here is the map of Virginia. This is what the House of Representatives looks like. So you've got your 9th district, which is where we live. And then look, though, everything is based on population. So look here and go to, you got Fairfax and you got Loudoun counties here. And look at these. Just to show you, this right here was in the 2016 election. You got Democrats and Republicans. Now, if you were to look at that, you would think that Donald Trump won the state of Virginia, but guess what? He didn't. Hillary Clinton did. You know why? Because this is where most of your population, there's more population in these 2 districts here than they are in all of these combined. The United States from confederation to a federal system. So again, you can see here the United States as a confederation, And now we have a federal system of government, which is called federalism. And again, think about that today when you look to our neighbors over in Tennessee who are going to school right now and playing high school football. That's because they've got a different governor. They're a completely different state government setup than what we are here in Virginia. So you can look at this table here and see how the Constitution resolved 3 issues of equality. So, for example, equality of the states. It says here the solution that according to the Connecticut Compromise, states have equal representation in the Senate, but representation in the House is proportionate to population. So again, that's where that Connecticut Compromise comes in. What to do about slavery? Again, we come up with the 3/5 compromise. And equality in voting, should it be based on universal manhood suffrage, or should it be restricted? Well, what happened was the states were allowed to decide the qualifications for voting. And we're looking at that right now when you see certain things like possibly mail-in voting. Of course, later on, the federal government did get involved to fix some of the issues there. So, for example, the 15th Amendment of the Constitution allowed African-American men the right to vote, which was shortly after the Civil War. The 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. And then the 26th Amendment actually lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And the purpose of that was this was during the Vietnam War. And again, it's the idea that I'm 18 years old and I'm old enough to fight for my country, but I'm not old enough to fight for the commander-in-chief who's sending me into war, especially when I'm getting drafted. So that's where your 26th Amendment came in. So we're going to finish up here with our anti-federalist and our federalist positions. And of course, these were the 2 competing groups of people who supported the Constitution, who were against the Constitution. So you can see here, your Federalists supported the Constitution, your anti-Federalists were against it. This will also be the beginnings of your first political parties, which will have your Federalist, then your Anti-Federalist, which will then change their names to your Democratic Republicans. And then we'll go through, and today, of course, we have our modern-day Republican and Democrat Party. Well, your Federalists, if we'll look on the right here, they wanted a strong national government. And again, their argument was we're not going to have another dictator because we have 3 separate co-equal branches of government that will provide checks on the other so that one that is not too powerful. So don't worry about having another dictator. They believed that a large republic could best protect individual liberty. They drew support from large farmers, merchants, and artisans. Remember, artisans were people who work with their hands. And then they believed that a Bill of Rights was unnecessary. You remember, your Bill of Rights are your first 10 amendments. Your anti-federalists were against the Constitution. They were scared of a too strong the national government. They felt that it would infringe on our individual rights. They believed that only a small republic could protect these rights. They drew support from small farmers in rural areas, and they believed that a Bill of Rights was necessary to protect individual liberty. So think about things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, the right to bear arms, protect against unlawful searches and seizures, no cruel and unusual punishment, a right to trial by jury. Those things we'll get into in the next unit with the Constitution. So guys, that is going to finish us up. And we are going to take a test. You can use your notes on this test, and then we'll start to get into the Constitution.